Questions to the Prime Minister. The Reverend William McRae.
Number one, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have been asked to reply. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, is attending the G20 summit in Mexico. And, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the whole House will wish to join me in paying tribute to those servicemen who have lost their lives in Afghanistan since the last Prime Minister's question time. Lance Corporal James Ashworth of the 1st Battalion, Grenadier Guards, and Corporal Alex Guy of the 1st Battalion, the Royal Anglian Regiment. Our sincere condolences are with their families and their loved ones. Last week I visited our armed forces in Helmand, where I was once again reminded of their exceptional work on behalf of this country, and that work and these sacrifices must never be forgotten.
Reverend William McRae.
Mr. Speaker, I join the Foreign Secretary in expressing our deepest sympathy to the families of our fallen heroes and pray God will comfort them. Belfast International Air Link into Heathrow is an invaluable asset to the economy of Northern Ireland. There are deep concerns, however, that this link is at risk because the landing slots are allocated to carriers rather than to regional airports. Will the Government urgently publish an aviation strategy that ensures our international airport maintains its link with Heathrow?
Well, the Department for Transport, Mr. Speaker, will consult on our future aviation policy in the summer and ask for evidence on options about maintaining the UK's status as an international hub for aviation. He is quite right that the London to Belfast link is important to the economy. There are currently more than 18,000 flights per year between the two Belfast airports and the 5 main London airports. And I hope he agrees that our steps to devolve power to set air passenger duty rates for direct long-haul flights departing from Northern Ireland will also boost investment and tourism.
Mr. Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my right honourable friend will know from my recent letter to the Prime Minister, the situation at the Corrigan Oil Refinery on the Thames is becoming increasingly difficult. In an attempt to support manufacturing, secure well-paid jobs and secure our UK fuel supplies, will he use the offices of the Prime Minister to secure an urgent summit bringing together the heads of Biz, DEC and the Treasury to explore every single avenue possible to keep this refinery open?
Well, I know this has been very disappointing news, and my honourable friend has been very, very active on this. The workforce and the local community have worked tirelessly to help the administrator secure the long-term future of the refinery. We're keeping in close contact with the administrators who are still looking at further options, working with Thurrock Council's task force as well. And the Minister of State at DEC has met with representatives of the workforce and local community. I will, of course, draw his remarks to the attention of the Prime Minister as well.
Harman.
Can I join the Foreign Secretary in paying tribute to Lance Corporal James Ashworth of the 1st Battalion Grenadier Guards and Corporal Alex Guy of the 1st Battalion, the Royal Anglian Regiment. They died serving our country with the utmost bravery, and we join him in sending our deepest condolences to their family and friends. Mr. Speaker, whilst we know there's still a long way to go before the people of Burma get the democracy to which they're entitled, the fact that progress has been made is due to the extraordinary commitment and courage of one woman enduring more than 2 decades of house arrest. Will the Foreign Secretary join me in expressing our utmost admiration for Aung San Suu Kyi?
Well, I absolutely will, and I think it's highly appropriate to raise this in Prime Minister's question time. I was, I think, the first European foreign minister to visit Aung San Suu Kyi, to visit Burma at the beginning of this year, and found her not only in reputation but in substance an absolutely inspirational figure. There is still a long way to go, as the Right Honourable Lady says, not only in bringing democracy to Burma but ending ethnic conflicts. One of those continues in Kachin State. So we look to the government of Burma to continue to travel on this road to release remaining political prisoners, and I think across all parties we look forward to giving Daw Aung San Suu Kyi a tremendous welcome tomorrow.
Harriet Harman.
I thank the Foreign Secretary for that answer, and he was right to visit Burma when he did. And whilst we support the suspension of sanctions on Burma, will he reassure us that the position of the British government will remain, that sanctions will be reimposed unless there is sustained progress towards democracy and the rule of law?
Well, that is very much our position, and I have said that in terms to the Foreign Minister of Burma. And indeed, we argued within the European Union that sanctions and restrictive measures should not be lifted unconditionally, but should be suspended, so that they can be reimposed if necessary and if progress comes to a stop. So they have been suspended for 12 months. Of course, we will continue to review progress through that period. I believe, having met the President of Burma on my visit, that he is absolutely sincere in his intentions, but of course there will be elements within the government of Burma who are not so enthusiastic about these changes and who will be alarmed about the success in recent by-elections of Aung San Suu Kyi and her party. So we will keep up the pressure as well as the welcome for these changes.
Harriet Harman.
I thank the Foreign Secretary for that answer and for his commitment to keep up the pressure for progress. Now can I turn to domestic issues and specifically the National Health Service? This week, a survey showed that 90% of primary care trusts, because of the financial pressure they are under, are restricting access to treatment. This is going to particularly hit older people. How can he justify an elderly person with cataracts in both eyes being told that they can only have surgery in one of them? How can he justify that?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's totally unacceptable if trusts are rationing on grounds of financial considerations. And the NHS medical director has written to trusts to tell them the only criteria of decision must be clinical and not financial. If evidence is found that they're ignoring that, then the Secretary of State can intervene. The Department of Health will look into any cases where they're using financial conditions. Allegations of this have been made before, including under the last government, but the Department of Health are very clear about that, and that should be welcomed across the House.
Harriet Harman.
But there is evidence, and he's still not acting. And it's not just cataract operations. There are 125 different treatments being rationed on the grounds of cost, including hip and knee replacements. What does he say to an elderly patient who needs a hip replacement? Wait in pain or try to pay and go private? What does he say?
Well, I say three things. I say, first of all, what I just said before in answering the question about rationing. Secondly, that arbitrarily restricting access to operations wasn't just happening under the last government, it was allowed under the last government, such as in 2007, patients in Suffolk had to wait a minimum of 14 weeks for routine surgery. York NHS Trust was told then by its PCT not to operate on non-urgent cases until they waited a minimum of 20 weeks. And I say a third thing, which is, to any of those individuals, their GP, their doctor should be going to work tomorrow, not on strike. And we on this side of the House encourage them to go to work. And I hope she and all of that side of the House will say clearly today that those doctors should be at work tomorrow.
Harriet Harman.
We don't want patients to suffer, so we don't want the GPs to be going on strike. But, Mr. Speaker, we are proud of what we did in the NHS. More doctors, more nurses, cutting the waiting list, and it's always the same. Labour builds up the NHS and the Tories drag it down. Now, today he's saying that he's 100% behind the government's health plans. But it's a different story in his own constituency, isn't it? Last month, the Foreign Secretary took to the streets, marching in protest against the NHS cuts. And let's remind ourselves of what the Prime Minister said about midwives. Just before the general election, The Prime Minister wrote for the Sun newspaper, because professionally, of course, they were all in it together. And he said in the Sun, he said, "We will increase the number of midwives by 3,000. Can he confirm they've broken their promise on midwives?
Well, that was a long question, although I congratulate her on not having the Shadow Chancellor here today, which does help everybody to hear and concentrate on these things. He's obviously the Chancellor's at the G20. The Shadow Chancellor is presumably doing another opinion poll on what people think of him. But on the questions that she asked, and by the way, we could have told them that for nothing. But on the questions that more value under the Conservatives. But on the questions that she asked, I am glad she says GPs should be at work tomorrow, because she should tell that to her own spokesman, the Honourable Lady for Hackney North and Stoke Newington, who said she had a lot of sympathy with the BMA and there'd be a lot of public support for the action that they are taking. So there is a clear division across the floor of the House. It is perilous for her to go into the affairs of another constituency, because what is happening in my constituency is nothing to do with funding or health reforms. But I'll tell her all about that separately if she would like. And we are proud, she says we are proud of what's happened in the National Health Service when we look at average waiting times for both inpatients and outpatients are lower than at the last general election. That the best performance ever has now been attained for patients waiting after 18 weeks to be treated, that the total number of qualified clinical staff is higher than at the election, that there are 3,900 more doctors since the election, and that hospital infection levels are at their lowest levels since surveillance of them began.
Harriet Harman!
He never answered the question about midwives, because before the election, the leader of the opposition was all, yes, we can. As soon as he became Prime Minister, it's no, we can't. Yeah. Services rationed, patients suffering, and public satisfaction at a new low. That's the Tories on the NHS. The Prime Minister once told us he could sum up his priority in 3 letters. NHS. Isn't it more like LOL? Yeah.
It obviously took a long time to think of that one. I have set out the achievements of the government on the National Health Service. Even the King's Fund, in its latest report, which has sometimes been quoted by the opposition, so there's no evidence of a decline in service quality or performance, and that infection rates have not noticeably deteriorated, remaining relatively stable in most measures, or in the case of MRSA and C. difficile, reducing. These are important achievements in the health service, and they are a contrast with the health spokesman of the opposition saying in June 2010 it is irresponsible to increase NHS spending in real terms. And they are a contrast with the number of managers doubling under the Labour Party, a contrast with their last year in power where the number of NHS managers rose 6 times as fast as nurses, and a huge contrast with Wales where Labour are cutting NHS spending.
Mr. Peter Bone.
Mr. Speaker, given the appalling behaviour of Liberal Cabinet members in not supporting the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, would my preferred Deputy Prime Minister arrange a divorce from the Yellow Peril so that we can govern with Conservative policies as a minority government?
I think the...
Order! I'm sure members, having heard the question, will wish to hear the answer.
I'm sure they will, Mr. Speaker. And I think actually my honourable friend bringing up the subject of divorce may be deeply troubling to Mrs. Bone. And we should all seek to reassure her immediately that he is only talking about a political one. But as someone who helped to negotiate the coalition and who values enormously our cooperation with the Liberal Democrats, I will not be advocating a divorce in the government.
Can the Foreign Secretary confirm that apart from Italy, the UK is the only country in the G20 in a double-dip recession?
Well, actually, the actual fact of the matter is that the IMF now forecast that in the coming year, the British economy... Well, they may not want to know what is going to happen, what has been said by the IMF. The Shadow Chancellor, again, is not here with his hand gestures, but he has always said we should take notice of the IMF. And they say that in the coming year that the British economy is going to grow faster than the German or French economy. That next year, growth in the British economy will be similar to that of the United States and twice that of the Eurozone. And that would not be happening had we not brought the excessive deficits and debts of the last government under control.
Esther McVeigh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In light of the historic signing in China for record investment to Wirral Waters, also the granting of the turnaround cruise terminal in Liverpool, and the support of the automotive industries for 1,000 more jobs at Jaguar and saving of Vauxhall Ellesmere Port, would you say that this government had done more in 2 years to expand private enterprise on Merseyside than Labour did in its entire tenure?
Well, yes, I would, Mr. Speaker. I would say exactly that. And I would point out that that success which she described is part, in the last 2 years, of British exports to Brazil going up 37%, British exports to China going up 61%, British exports to India going up 73%, and that is also because the British government is out there championing British business, which the other side neglected to do.
Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Secretary of State inform the House why it is in the proposals for regional pay that why he wants to see his nurses in Richmond, Yorkshire, to be paid substantially less than, say, nurses doing exactly the same job, say, in Richmond, Surrey?
Well, this is an issue that the pay review bodies are now examining, as the honourable member will know. They will report next month. But the case for local pay, and they will make their recommendations, we can all debate that, the case for local pay was once made by a Chancellor of the Exchequer, who said it makes sense to recognise that a more considered approach to local and regional conditions in pay offers the best modern route to full employment in our country. That Chancellor of the Exchequer was his near neighbour, the Right Honourable Member for Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath.
Tessa Munn.
Where's Gordon?
Order! I'm sure Conservative backbenchers wish to hear from one of their coalition colleagues, Tessa Munt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Department of Health accepts that radiotherapy is the cheapest and most effective way of treating cancer. Despite this, the department will spend over £1.5 billion on cancer drugs this year, but less than a third of that on radiotherapy. In the South West, several of our hospitals rely on charity to fund basic radiotherapy services. The Cancer Drugs Fund is underspent by...
Order! A one-sentence question and a short sentence. Tessa Munt.
So could the right honourable gentleman speak to the Prime Minister about authorising the investment of that unused money into radiotherapy so hospitals in my region can cure cancer?
Well, my honourable friend is obviously right to point to the importance of radiotherapy. Of course, it's also important to stress that decisions on treatment should be made by clinicians based on whatever is most appropriate for their patients. But we are investing over £150 million more over the next 4 years to expand radiotherapy capacity, and I know my honourable friend will welcome that, as well as the fact that at the same time over 12,500 extra patients have benefited from the £650 million Cancer Drugs Fund introduced by this government.
Mr. Adrian Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Regional Growth Fund is the government's flagship scheme for boosting jobs and growth in the regions. The recent National Audit Office report criticised it for spending too much money on projects creating too few jobs, in some cases £200,000 per job. What is the government doing about it?
Well, the honourable member's own region will benefit importantly from the Regional Growth Fund, including £235 million from the Regional Growth Fund. Of course it is important that that money is spent effectively, and my ministerial colleagues will do their utmost to ensure that is happening. But it's also important to remember that his region benefits from so many other things the government is doing, including infrastructure projects to support growth in the West Midlands, an enterprise zone in Birmingham city centre, an enterprise zone for the Black Country, and these measures are much more likely to get regional growth going than the excessive tax and spending of the party opposition.
Stride!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, Ian Tapp, has now lost 300 cattle to bovine TB, a scourge that has been exacerbated by the fact that the last government did precisely nothing about this issue. Whilst I recognise the sterling work this government has done, would my right honourable friend reassure my livestock farmers that when it comes to disease control regulations, there will be proportionality and nothing that is likely to detract from their livelihood?
Yes, my honourable friend raises a very important issue. Bovine TB is a devastating disease. It's one of the most serious challenges facing the British cattle farming industry, and last year around 26,000 cattle were compulsorily slaughtered in England alone. DEFRA will be making an announcement tomorrow about how they intend to proceed on this subject. Cattle measures continue to be the foundation of our TB control programme, but it's clear that in some areas these alone are not sufficient, so I invite him to stand by for a further announcement on that tomorrow.
Hamilton. Mr. Speaker, the Foreign Secretary will be aware that today His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama of Tibet is in London and will be visiting Parliament this afternoon. On such an auspicious day, will he use this opportunity to restate his government's commitment to the human rights of Tibetans within China?
We believe in this country and in this House in the universality of human rights. And that is a point that I often make to Chinese leaders, including in the strategic dialogue that I conduct with China on an annual basis. We also have a formal human rights dialogue with China, which we do not shy away from raising any of these cases. Of course, we do see, as did the last government, we see Tibet as part of the People's Republic of China, but we also look for meaningful dialogue between representatives of the Dalai Lama and the Chinese authorities, and we will continue to support that.
Simon Hughes.
The government has made clear its commitment to root out tax avoidance by public officials and civil servants. Can the Foreign Secretary make clear that the government will be equally robust in rooting out tax avoidance by the corporate sector who do jobs for government or are employed by the government?
Yes, absolutely, and I won't mention to the Deputy Prime Minister his slip. No, but it's entirely between ourselves in these four walls. Yes, absolutely. The Chancellor set out very clearly in the budget his absolute determination to deal with tax avoidance and to do so without warning in future. And I know if the Chancellor was here, he would say that that applies to the corporate sector as well.
Order number 8, closed question. Jim Fitzpatrick.
Number 8, sir.
The government believes it is not reasonable or fair that households should receive a greater income from benefits than the average weekly wage for working households. In some cases, it can be more than double the average household income, and our changes will mean no family on benefits will earn more than a working family's average salary, £26,000 a year for couple and single-parent households. This strikes the right balance between supporting families and providing incentives to work.
Jim Fitzpatrick.
Speaker, rent levels in London and near Canary Wharf in my constituency are disproportionately high. Job Centre Plus have written to 900 families in my constituency who have between them 2,000 to 4,000 children that their benefits will be cut on average on the 1st of April by £200 a month. This will either cause them to rack up rent arrears or have to move. Mayor Boris Johnson
Social cleanses.
Question. One sentence.
Says he will not preside over the removal of the poor from inner London. Boris gets it, why doesn't the government?
Well, I know that the honourable member has long-running concerns about this and has frequently expressed them. And I think it's important to stress that for all but the most expensive parts of London, at least 30% of all private rental properties will be affordable. In London, under the system that we inherited, 150 families were receiving housing benefit of over £50,000 a year. And that is not acceptable to the taxpayers of this country in general. Our reforms are fair. Housing benefit will still be paid to meet rents of almost £21,000 a year. There is also a £190 million fund for discretionary payments to help local authorities with the changes, and including assistance to renegotiate lower rents with landlords. But the principle remains, and I say it again, that it is not fair that people on housing benefit can afford to live in streets and homes that people out working hard are unable to live in themselves.
Simon Hart!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Wales is the only nation in the UK without a single yard of electrified rail track, thanks in part to the party opposite. As a former Secretary of State for Wales, could the Foreign Secretary persuade the government that extending the track as far as Swansea, not just Cardiff, will be great for jobs, great for Wales, and somewhat cheaper than the current refurb of Tottenham Court Station?
Well, I know my right honourable friend, the Welsh Secretary, is working hard on this. We are committed to electrifying more than 300 miles of railway routes, which compares actually with just 9 miles electrified under the last government. An interesting contrast in infrastructure investment. The Department for Transport is currently considering a business case for electrification between Cardiff and Swansea, prepared in Wales, and I understand the decision will be made by the summer, and of course it will depend on whether it's affordable and on the assessment of competing priorities as well.
Mr. Angus Robertson.
Mr. Speaker, there's more work to do, but for the third month unemployment has reduced in Scotland, and for the second year in a row Scotland is the best performing location for foreign direct investment in the UK. Would the Foreign Secretary take the opportunity to congratulate the Scottish Government and Scottish Development International, which is the lead agency that secures foreign direct investment?
Well, the honourable member is quite right to draw attention to the employment figures, which we must never be complacent about, and there is always so much more work to do. But the right honourable lady didn't ask about these, and they do show a quarterly fall in unemployment of 51,000. And they do show the rate of unemployment coming down in the quarter, and importantly, youth unemployment coming down by 29,000 in the last quarter, but long-term unemployment is still rising, and that remains a challenge. Of course, Scotland, as part of the United Kingdom, is an attractive place to invest in, and I congratulate many Scottish people and businesses on their work. They'd have much harder work to do if Scotland were not part of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While welcoming overseas students who come to this country to get a world-class education, then return home to benefit their countries, will my right honourable friend look extremely sceptically on vice-chancellors who believe they cannot compete unless students are given an additional incentive to stay on in this country legally or illegally, especially as last year 120,000 students sought and were granted the right to extend their stay here?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. As my right honourable friend knows, the government's introduced radical reforms to stamp out abuse and restore order to what was an out-of-control student visa system, making the immigration system easier for students, universities and the UK border agency to operate. So we are closing bogus colleges and regulating the remainder, restricting the right to work here and bring dependents, and making sure that all but the very best go home at the end of their studies. And on that basis, of course, talented students from around the world are welcome here in the United Kingdom.
Mr. Dennis McShane.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As MP for Rotherham, can I welcome the fact that the right honourable gentleman has realised the ambition thwarted in 2001 and briefly is in charge of the clattering train. But will he take this opportunity, as we have 2 Asian Nobel Prize winners here in the House of Commons this week, to invite a third, Liu Xiaobo, currently rotting in the Chinese gulag, who was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize last December, not to refer to it in the Human Rights Dialogue, but from the dispatch box, mention his name, Liu Xiaobo, and invite him here to London for next year.
Sir William Hague.
Well, it is good that nice words about Rotherham are being exchanged at Prime Minister's question time, so I welcome the question from the Right Honourable Member for Rotherham. We do raise individual cases, of course, with the Chinese, and often do so publicly, but I will assess which ones to raise and when to do so, of course. But the human rights dialogue that we have with China is very important, and it's important that in China there is an understanding of our deep concerns about many of these cases. He can rest assured I will be raising them.
Got his answer on Liu Xiaobo. The Right Honourable Gentleman will doubtless be content. Mr. Christopher Chope.
In the cause of deficit reduction, the government is reducing funding to the police by 20% in real terms over 4 years. Can my right honourable friend therefore assure me that also in the cause of deficit reduction, he will be insisting on a reduction in our contribution to the European Union budget by more than 20%?
Highly desirable as that would be, my honourable friend is aware that that contribution is not decided by a single decision of government, but is the balance between two large figures determined in other ways. He can rest assured, however, that we will be far better at negotiating about this than the honourable members opposite. The Shadow Foreign Secretary is sitting there, and when he was Minister for Europe, the party opposite gave away £7 billion of the British rebate for nothing in return, and that was an abject failure of negotiation and leadership that we will not repeat.
Bill Wilson.
Does the Foreign Secretary agree with the words of the Honourable Member for Wrexham when he was quoted in the Newcastle Journal as saying, "I see no economic argument for regional pay"?
Well, I think there is a variety of views, Mr. Speaker, about regional and local pay in all political parties, and I pointed out earlier the views expressed by the former leader of the Labour Party on local pay and regional pay. It's also worth pointing out that the last government in 2007 introduced local pay into Her Majesty's Courts and Tribunal Service.
Heather Wheeler.
Would my right honourable friend agree with me what a wonderful announcement it was for the investment in Derby for Rolls-Royce, future engineering jobs, Bombardier looking for 44 more jobs, and unemployment in South Derbyshire has gone down by 150 in the last 2 months?
This indeed is good news, as my honourable friend says. It is good news for investment in this country, it is good news for Derby and the surrounding area, and it is good news for the long-term security of this country that we are prepared to invest confidently in submarine technologies for the long term.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Foreign Secretary tell the House how the Snoopers Charter, which the government plans to introduce shortly, differs from the proposals in 2009, which both governing parties opposed when they were sat on this side of the House?
It differs substantially from that, enormously from that, because the proposal of the last government was to hold all data in a central database. This is requiring providers to hold on to their data. And although he uses the catchphrase of a Snoopers charter, this is designed to be a criminal's nightmare. And unless we update it, unless we update our ability to detect terrorism, to detect criminality in this country, then that will have a very serious effect. So I encourage him to look at this in detail. It is very important for maintaining law and order in the UK.
David Amis.
Is the right honourable friend aware that the highlight of the Olympic torch relay would take place on the 6th of July when it arrives in Southend, to be met by a choir of 2,000 on the longest pier in the world with the new iconic building? Would my right honourable friend agree with me that the Olympic Games is an opportunity for our country to come together and celebrate this government putting the great back into Britain?
Well, the arrival of the torch in Southend is one of the highlights of the other highlight being the fact that today it is passing through Richmond at Yorkshire. And actually, I would have dearly loved to have been there to see it, but that is one of the highlights. He is quite right. This is an enormous opportunity for this country. We're looking through the Olympic Games to secure over £1 billion worth of inward investment to attract an additional 4 million extra visitors, including to Southend, to use the Games to inspire more young people to take up sport. It is a great moment for Britain.
Luciana Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We all know that the Prime Minister likes. Forgive me. We all know the Prime Minister likes to chillax down the pub, but when it comes to Anglo-French relations, shouldn't he adopt a more sober approach?
Well, I must say that the Prime Minister always has excellent relations, in my experience, with any President of France, including with the new President of France. And we should welcome and applaud the fact that the city we are sitting in today is the 7th largest city for French people in the world. And of course, they're welcome here in the United Kingdom, whatever their government is doing at home.